Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Headlines, the go-to space for your weekly news updates. My name is Amalina Kamal from the News Desk and I'm joined by Hazwin Hassan, who is our news editor. Thank you, Hazwin, for joining us again.
Thank you for having me.
Since we're talking about all the essential updates that you need to know, right? For this week, a lot of things had happened from the federal court's ruling, of Najib and Son paying, their backdated taxes to MYAirlines and budget 2014. So maybe Hazwin, you can go through the first update of today, which is Najib Raza and his son.
Yes, to give you the laydown on what's happened to this father and son duo. So it's been going on for a number of years, as I'm sure a lot of our viewers are aware of. The federal court ruling from yesterday means that Najib and his son, Dato Sri Najib Raza, and his son, Dato Nazifuddin, will now have to pay about 1.7 or up to about 1.7 billion ringgit in unpaid taxes. They'll have to settle their unpaid taxes that they've accumulated over the years. Now, they were served firstly by the IRB a couple of years ago. So basically the IRB, the Inland Revenue Board, served them a notice saying that you have to pay up your taxes, you have to settle your taxes. And then what followed next was the father and son, they appealed the summary judgment that was then decided by the High Court. So they appealed to not have to pay the taxes, but yesterday's federal court ruling meant that their appeal was finally dismissed.
Yeah, and this is the whole premise behind, pay up first and talk later. And just to add that the High Court's ruling is based on Section 1031 of the Income Tax Act. And Hazwin, I believe when it comes to tax and death, these are the two things that it's hard for us to escape.
No escape from taxes and death, as they say.
Right. So moving on to the next thing that was trending last week is MYAirline's fiasco. Now, on October 9th, there was a particular report in terms of highlighting MYAirline's financial woes, apparently following a heated town hall. Ex-CEO Rainer Teo abruptly resigned, and that was just 2 months prior to the airline having to celebrate its anniversary. So what transpired afterwards was a spiral of events when it comes to locking a major shareholder to help sustain operations. However, at the 11th hour, this particular shareholder pulled out, and that caused the airline suspending operations entirely. Now, this is bad news for ticket holders in specific, which is why our Transport Ministry and Transport Minister itself, Anthony Loke, coming in urging the airlines to, approach them and talk things through, because this would eventually mar, the confidence towards our own aviation. A lot of passengers being uncertain with what's supposed to come, no notification, nothing, but at least rival airlines came in to help out in terms of rerouting passengers. That's at least something. But, yesterday's update was saying that even Dato' Azharuddin himself stepped out, and now the airline's operation still remains uncertain. So we just have to see what comes up in the next few days.
Yes, definitely.
Right. Okay, quickly, before we go into budget, I think the latest update is that our Prime Minister, Dato' Sri Anwar Ibrahim, is actually making a trip down to Riyadh, right?
Yes.
Hazwin?
So he's going to visit the the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. He was called on by a special invite there, and specifically, basically, to meet with other world leaders to address the situation in Palestine. So the issue that he has with the Israeli-Palestine conflict is that he is calling out the West for their hypocrisy. He's saying that when it comes to the conflict in Israel and Palestine and what's being faced by the Palestinians, the West seems to have a more biased attitude towards them, as opposed to, say, how they reacted and felt strongly about Ukraine and Russia. So he's going there to address that issue, and he wants to expedite urgent action to get a resolution once and for all.
Okay. more on the local front, right? Last week on Friday, Budget 2020-14 was tabled, and of course, to give us more detail and help us unpack what was tabled, we have Malaysia University of Science and Technology's very own Professor Geoffrey Williams. Welcome, Professor, to the show.
Thanks for inviting me.
So a lot of things was highlighted in budget, and one of it is that budget. Actually, this particular budget is actually the highest allocation among the many that was tabled before. But when we talk about a high budget allocation, how would that actually help the economy, right?
Well, there are two ways to look at it. One is that it will help, the other is that it won't help. The general view will be that when the government spends money, it adds to overall domestic demand or overall aggregate demand. And if there isn't sufficient spending by consumers, for example, or by companies on investment, the government can use its spending to pump some extra demand into the economy. So if we think now at the moment that global demand is on a bit of a downturn or is still quite sluggish, then there won't be too much push on economic growth from the external trade. So some people would say, well, it's important then that government compensate for that by pushing up overall government spending to help the domestic economy.
This is also because past excesses resulted in a national debt and liabilities reaching close to 1.5 trillion, and that's a lot. At least when it comes to where the government is coming from, like how quickly can we resolve this debt that we're facing right now?
Well, in terms of total debt, you can't reduce that quickly. It cannot be reduced quickly. You can reduce it consistently over time by trying to pay it off. What you can do is reduce the total debt as a percentage of gross domestic product, but that doesn't actually reduce the debt. And it doesn't in particular reduce the financing costs of the debt. The financing costs of government debt are actually the second largest amount of money that the government pays after education. So it is a very significant amount of money. It's 46 billion ringgit. What that means is they're spending money financing debt, which could otherwise be spent on education and health and social protection and so on. So what you really want to try to do is to keep the total amount of debt down, because not so much because of the amount of debt, but because of the financing of the debt. And what you will see over time is that if you can keep that down, as a percentage of GDP, it will become smaller and smaller and smaller. And then it becomes more and more affordable in the sense that you are holding on to the financing costs and trying to keep the financing costs stable rather than having the financing costs increase.
Well, you also mentioned that in a statement that this particular budget is fiscally responsible. What do you mean by that?
You said it was you sort of characterized it as being fiscally responsible, which I think you sort of gave credit where credit is due. But you had still one issue. Your main gripe with it was that some of the initiatives, part of the spending, is just not transparent enough. So could you just sort of revisit that?
Yeah, sure. So when we think about fiscal responsibility, there are sort of three aspects to it. The first is that you're spending within your means. You're not spending more than the revenue that you have. Well, of course, the government does, and it has been doing that for decades. But this time around, the deficit has been reduced. And that's because the total spending, although it's now record level, it didn't increase very much. It only increased by 3.3%, which is pretty much in line with inflation. But the revenue side also improved. And what that means is that the deficit overall went down. And that's the first way we look at fiscal responsibility, which is spending within your means. The second is about the efficiency of the spending, cutting out wastage and leakage and especially corruption, and making sure that you can make savings in how you spend the money. And in the current budget, it also includes subsidy rationalization. So we are seeing subsidy rationalization, particularly in utilities. But the third part, which is what you mentioned, is how do you actually spend the money and where does the money actually go to in terms of the type of project that you're funding, and in particular, who gets that money? And that requires a lot of scrutiny. Why is it that a particular company has got it? Why is it that it's already been allocated before we've even had any discussion of whether it's necessary or not? That's a third element of fiscal responsibility, which requires a lot of transparency, and that's what we're missing.
Is this why you brought up the whole idea that this is a means to sort of give a pre-awarded contract to middlemen?
It looked to me, in some instances, that the policy had been designed in such a way that money would be available for people to implement it. And these people who implement it are the middlemen, the rent seekers, the cronies, if you want to call it that. There is much less of that in this budget than we have seen in decades of previous budgets. And it's certainly true that the Prime Minister has made it very clear that he wants to reduce that. But it appears to me there's still a lot of this old-style policy design where the policy is designed in a specific way that someone is going to be paid money to implement it when there's no need for them to be paid to implement it. And there are still some elements of that. And that's another part of the lack of transparency. Well, in terms of budget overall, I would say this is one of the best budgets I've seen in 20 years of being in Malaysia. So in that respect, I think it's a very big improvement of over what we have seen before. But I can just see some of the elements of the old-style budgeting sneaking in somewhere, one way or another. You see, the money comes from you and from me and from everybody watching this show, right? We paid our taxes. That's where the money comes from. This is public money. So it has to be spent properly and efficiently. And I think we see much more of that in terms of the emphasis on cutting out waste and leakages and corruption, and then reducing the inefficiencies of the subsidies in particular, and getting more value for your money.
Right. Well, talking about revenues and everything, obviously one form of where the government is able to get that is via taxes, and then we see a lot of tax reforms being introduced in this budget as well. One is in terms of the capital gains tax, and another is the global tax, global minimum tax. So does that, okay, first, would the capital gain tax actually be counterproductive to, helping out MSMEs, because separately the government is also allowing for a certain allocation for MSMEs to fork out? And second, with global minimum tax introduced, how would that deter investors?
Okay, so if we look at the capital gains tax to begin with, it will actually affect a relatively small number of people, and it will only affect really the most wealthy. And so in that respect, micro, small and medium-sized enterprises wouldn't, in my view, have very much to be concerned about in terms of the effect of the tax, unless they were very successful and then they wanted to cash in on that success. Then they will make a capital gain, then they have to pay the tax on that. But I think they probably would be quite happy of having made the improvement in the first place. So I'm not sure that that would make a big impact. Now, in terms of the minimum global tax, in a sense, Malaysia has a choice where they can sort of turn against the global consensus on it, or accept the global consensus on it. So the view is that they will accept the global consensus on that. But it, again, only affects a very limited number of companies in very specific circumstances.
Right. So sorry to interrupt, but at least the global minimum tax here is set to be only to be introduced in 2025. So I suppose there's still a runway period in terms of, repositioning how this will be introduced of sorts, right? Sorry, I cut you off a little bit earlier. Do you want to end anything when it comes to...
Well, I mean, I think that's an important point that you're making, which is that the tax changes that we've seen, the capital gains tax, the global minimum tax, even the sugar tax, for example, the luxury goods tax, for example, these are affecting relatively small numbers of people, and they tend to affect the most wealthy people or the most wealthy companies. And but they are still raising revenue in meaningful ways, which is why the total deficit is able to come down. And there are very many people calling for GST, the reintroduction of GST, because they want to raise more revenue. Now, my view about that is, why? Why do you want to raise more revenue? Well, you want to raise more revenue because you want to spend, but the government's already spending a record amount. And it isn't necessarily a lack of spending which is causing problems in education or health or so on. It's how the money is spent. It's a question of the management of that money at an individual level in terms of the the health ministry responsibilities, the education ministry responsibilities, higher education ministry responsibilities, social protection responsibilities. Because actually what the government's able to do is cut the waste, cut the leakage, cut the corruption, introduce some relatively small tax changes on the most wealthy, and still get a reduction in the deficit without going for this big push for GST.
Well, without having this big push for GST, but at least the government is still increasing the service tax percentage from 6 to 8%. So there's some sort of compensation there. At least, maybe you can share what was the reasoning behind that. Is it more of a political move to appease certain individuals or stakeholders?
I think that the change in SST was a little bit of a surprise. I don't think anybody had predicted that was going to happen. It does raise revenue, and so it hasn't broadened the tax base. What it's done is increase the tax from the existing tax base. And to me, that demonstrates actually that you can increase revenues without broadening the tax base, just by making this overall system more efficient.
Right. Okay.
So efficiency is the name of the game.
Absolutely, yes.
And the highest allocation at least goes to the Ministry of Health here. But I'm seeing that, well, apart from, helping to revive or at least restore facilities to be more efficient, so the Madani government is introducing a medical scheme to be expanded nationwide with 100 million ringgit worth of allocation, right? And also my Salam scheme here to continue for 2 years. Well, as far as schemes are concerned, usually the thing that brings about whether this sort of schemes is successful or not is in the PSA. Even with this My Salam scheme, I think we don't even know much about it. Like, what can at least the government do when it comes to, pushing for initiatives such as this? How can it be more visible to at least people like you and I, right? Or even if it doesn't benefit us that much, but at least we have some sort of awareness on this.
I think this is a big part of the problem, not just with the health schemes that you've mentioned, but with other social welfare schemes, which is that there are very many of them. Dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of different schemes. And people are often not aware of it. And if they want to take advantage of it, they often have to make individual applications for each individual scheme separately, often to a different ministry or a different agency. And this makes it very, very difficult for them to get access to these schemes. And all of that is very, very inefficient. Now, if you were to take away all of these individual welfare schemes and instead convert it into a direct cash transfer, then they would get the benefit of the cash. And they could then choose for themselves how they wanted to spend it. And in many instances, they would spend it on health insurance, actually. For sure they would. They would spend it on pension saving. For sure they would. They would spend it on their children's welfare. Of course they would. But at the moment, what they have to do is apply for the health insurance, apply for the pension.
So the SOP is actually quite rigorous.
Yes, and it becomes very, very difficult. And that means we have a long laundry list of saying, oh, we're helping this group, we're helping this group, we're helping another group, we're helping another group. But the amounts are very small. 100 million ringgit is actually tiny in the context of total health spending. It's so small that it will hardly pay for the implementation costs of the scheme. Okay, but at the same time, people are unaware of it. And it will only be in the Auditor General's report later on that we will find out whether it was spent or not.
Right. So, I mean, I suppose, okay, with that, right, I was just wondering, because came up on top of my mind, should there be more cross-ministerial roles or, efforts in terms of pushing out for these individual schemes? For instance, like when it comes to, raising awareness on at least this My Salam scheme, in which is under the MOH. Like, communications ministry is able to push that. I mean, they have the logistics for it, or like the mechanics for it, the actual experts for it. But we never really hear that. So at least, would you agree if there should be more cross-ministerial?
No, I don't agree. I think that there should be less.
Less.
I think that we shouldn't have these welfare programs, because these welfare programs are very difficult for people to access. And earlier we were talking about middlemen. Every one of these welfare programs has a middleman. Every one. The My Salam scheme, the insurance scheme, it has insurance companies are making money out of that scheme.
But is it not why we actually reach out to all these middlemen, because they have the database?
Yes, but the government is creating a database. The government is creating the new PADU database. So when the government has the new PADU database, and it will be piloted next month in November, and then it should be rolled out Q1 or Q2 of next year, when we have that data, the government will be able to identify individuals and know exactly whether your individual income is above or below a threshold that you need in order to live a decent life, and then to give you a direct cash transfer. And when we move to that system, which is sometimes called a reverse income tax scheme, this is very, very, very much more effective than having dozens and dozens and dozens of welfare schemes, everyone with a middleman, and everyone having a communications problem, many people not aware that these schemes are there, and so they don't benefit from it. One of the biggest problems of welfare schemes isn't that we're spending too much on it, or that there are too many of them. It's actually that people don't know that they're there, and they don't take advantage of it. Now, if we took away all of these schemes, ended all the cross-ministerial collaborations, took away the responsibility or the job of the communications ministry, and just gave people money and put it into their wallet or into their bank account directly, they would spend it on themselves, their families, and their communities as they choose, as they need. And that's much more effective.
I mean, going back to your point, the direct cash being transferred to the actual people who actually need it. Okay, well, we have to rush our program of sorts, but there's two main areas that we still want to go into. One is the Sumbangan Tunai Rahmah, in which the allocation for that has been increased from 8 billion to 10 billion. That's one. And the PTPTN rebates, apparently the percentage that was given is actually lower than what was expected. So I know that, Professor Jaffrey, you have a particular... Hold on. Professor, you have, you work closely with this whole PTPN issue and everything. Maybe we can start with that first. Yeah, okay. Do you agree with the amount of rebates, the percentage of rebates that's being introduced by the government?
No, I don't. Again, I think the rebate should be taken away completely, wholly taken away, and that the scheme should be actually closed, the loan scheme, because it has become unsustainable. Now, before the COVID pandemic, PTPTN produced a report when Wan Saiful was the chairman of PTPTN, and they said at that time that the entire system was becoming unsustainable financially, because students were finding it difficult to repay the loan. And so the amount that was being repaid was lower than the amount that they were issuing in new loans. Now, the problem with these rebates and discounts and so on is it makes that disconnect between the amount that's repaid and the amount that they're issuing out. It makes it worse. It doesn't make it better. It makes it very, very much worse, certainly for PTPTN. And the reason that that has arisen is because over time, far too many students have loans. And when they graduate, they start on very, very low salaries. And those salaries increase. For sure they increase, but it could be 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years before they get to a level where they can actively start to pay off their PTPTN loan. So when it was a very small number of people back in the 1996, 97 when it was set up, it sort of worked. You had a small amount of loans for a small number of students. Now you have very large loans for many hundreds of thousands of students every year. And it's become unsustainable financially. And it should be removed, completely removed. Do away with it. Yeah. And make higher education free in the public sector and in the private sector too. And then finance it through a graduate tax. So you start to pay back only when the higher education has a good effect on your salary. If you went to university, got a degree, your salary rises, then you will pay more income on that. Then the government gets more income for that and pays for the higher education. And you know what? It can actually afford to do that now based on the current allocations that are already in the higher education budget. That higher education in Malaysia can be free. In fact, in Sarawak, the state government in Sarawak has already made the target to have higher education for Sarawakians at the public universities in Sarawak free. And you can do that also at a federal level.
I see. Oh my God. Then that will be another discussion for this. Probably we will go into it, right? Okay. Before this, before we end the show, another thing, sumbangan tunai rahmah, cash subsidies, financial aid. Earlier, before the show, we were talking about how this was actually a way in terms of introducing, the government's way of helping out with achieving disposable incomes for our nation, right?
Yes.
But can you probably share in detail how that helps? Okay, sumbangan tunai rahmah is more of like, cash incentives. But how does that transpire?
This has its origins in BRIM. As you remember, under Tan Sri Moyden, when he was Deputy Prime Minister, I think, before he became Prime Minister. And at that time, it was very low. It was about 500 ringgit. And now, over time, it has become much more involved in terms of the number of people who are eligible for it, but also the amount. So the amount was increased to 3,700 ringgit. It's a form of cash transfer. It's as simple as that. And it's for people who are in a particular low-income category. Okay, to that extent, it has some value. It has some merit in raising people's income. But the problem is that it's paid in lump sums at particular times of the year. They call it phases. So phase 1 and phase 2 and phase 3. And it would be very much better if it was paid on a monthly basis. Because if it's paid on a monthly basis, it becomes part of your normal income. And then being part of your normal income, it's not a special amount. You get a lump sum ahead of Raya, you spend it, almost all of it, straight away. If it's given to you on a monthly basis, 3,700 is almost 300 a month.
Yeah.
That's an important amount of money that can be used by any family, any individual. That's the maximum amount that you can get, by the way. You have a big family and a big group of people. But if you were having 300 a month, that's life-changing, actually, in the sense that it can pay for your food, it can pay for even savings, it can pay for what you need on a stable basis, time and time again.
Savings, right?
Yes, yes. So, but I hope that we will see the last of this now, because when we have the new PADU scheme, it looks to me like they will be moving much closer toward a universal basic income based on a reverse income tax or tax credit scheme, which will give the monthly payment according to an income-based criteria. And that would be very much better.
Which easily translates as more targeted welfare.
Yes, very much more targeted welfare toward the targeted group without a need to go and apply to this ministry and that ministry, another ministry, another ministry, another ministry.
Added bureaucracy and so on. Right.
Okay, right. That wraps up today's show. Thank you so much to our guest, Professor Jeffrey Williams. We will definitely bring you more on the show to talk about what the budget has brought us. And don't forget to also catch us on NSC Online, our social media, as well as our YouTube channel to follow all the news developments that we just discussed today. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll see you in the next episode.